Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Research America Partner webinar, Science v. COVID-19, Promising COVID-19 Treatments Explained. Thanks to our speakers today and also to our partners, the Infectious Diseases Society of America and Pharma, for being part of this program. So COVID-19 treatments have made visible, I think, several key insights about research and development. First of all, the road from foundational research to viable treatments is long, hard, resource intensive. It requires both public and private sector investment, expertise, and resolve, or you just can't get there from here. Secondly, when R&D leads to viable solutions for healthcare threats, the significance of that accomplishment, it's not only profound now, it grows over time. Patients today, patients tomorrow will benefit, and the R&D itself becomes foundational for tomorrow's treatments and cures. Also, applying science, particularly to combat something as rapidly evolving as COVID-19, requires difficult judgment calls. Regulatory, medical, and public health decision-making, it's bound to evolve as the situation evolves and science keeps working. And that doesn't discount the importance of science. It reinforces it, because the more science is conducted, the more knowledge it produces, the easier it is to make those judgment calls. But that takes time, it just does. I think all of these attributes of science and evidence-based decision-making will factor into today's discussion, and it's a privilege to introduce the moderator and panelists. Before I do so, I just have to do a little bit of housekeeping. All audience members will be on mute for this program. We're on a Zoom platform. But please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and later on in the program, our panelists will field those questions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and speakers. So our moderator for today is Dr. Eleanor Perfetto. She's the Executive Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the National Health Council. Joining Eleanor on the panel is Dr. Raj Ghandi, and he is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's the director of HIV Clinical Services and Education at Massachusetts General. He's also the chair of the HIV Medicine Association and a member of the guideline panel for treatment and management of patients with COVID-19 for the Infectious Diseases Society of America. Dr. Jim Madera, who is the EVP of the American Medical Association, is also a Research America board member. And Denise Brooks-Williams is the Senior Vice President and CEO, North Market of the Henry Ford Health System. And she's also played a crucial role in Michigan's successful effort to reduce the disparities in COVID outcomes and deaths. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Mike Ybarra, who is the Vice President and Chief Medical Affairs at Pharma and an ER doc in all of his spare time, which he has none of. Eleanor, let me turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you so much, Ellie, and welcome everyone to our session today. I have the pleasure of being the moderator. I always think that that's the easier job in one of these. I don't have to present anything. So I have the pleasure of being the moderator. We have 4 terrific experts who are going to share their knowledge today about the array of treatments that are currently in use for COVID-19, how they work, which treatments to use when, how they're reimbursed, barriers to use, those kinds of things. So we're going to jump right into it, and I'm going to start with a couple of things that I want to let you know that as the moderator, my role is going to keep us on treatments and not let us venture off into the area of vaccines, which of course, especially this week, is going to be very tempting to do. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I stop just a few minutes before 2 o'clock so that I can turn this back over to Ellie. So if we don't get to your question because we run out of time, I apologize for that in advance. So we're going to begin this conversation by having a little bit of a brief introduction, what we're calling the Cliff Notes version of the variety of treatments that are out there right now that are being used. They fall into different classes. And so we're going to turn to the panel to ask for a little bit of background on what are these treatments and how do they differ from one another? Just a little bit of leveling the playing field for everyone, but in an abbreviated fashion. So Raj, I'm going to start with you to jump in on that.
Sure. So the way I think about treatments is I think about them in a couple of dimensions. It has to do, in my mind, as to the severity of the disease, and I think that's a way to anchor ourselves in terms of what treatments should be used when. So the vast majority of COVID-19 is mild to moderate. That is, people who aren't sick enough to be in the hospital. Maybe about 10% of people with COVID-19, maybe up to 15%, will get ill enough that they need to be hospitalized. So that's the severe category. And then there's critical illness, which obviously is the most severe phase. The reason why that's important is we think that viral replication, SARS-CoV-2 replication, is most active during the mild to moderate phases of disease, when people are not yet sick enough to be in the hospital, but have some symptoms. Once people are in the hospital, they, for example, need oxygen and therefore are in the hospital, we think that there's a hyperinflammatory or an excess inflammatory phase. And this will line up with our treatments in just a moment. So once you are on oxygen, certainly once you're critically ill, there's a lot of inflammation going on, and there's less viral replication going on. And that's important. The viral replication is a bit earlier. And then also, once you're in the hospital, there can be a hypercoagulability and a propensity to form blood clots. And so that's also part of the hallmark of severe or critical disease. So with that as a kind of a context, let's turn to the therapies briefly. Let's talk first about antivirals. Antivirals target one of two things. They either target the spike protein, that's the outer part of the virus that the virus uses to get into cells, or they target the replication machinery, the machinery of the virus that it uses to make copies of itself. An example of the drugs, antivirals that target the spike protein are the antibodies that we're all hearing about, monoclonal antibodies that now have emergency use authorization. Those are antivirals that target the spike protein. RNA polymerase, that's the copying machinery. That's targeted by the one and only FDA approved drug, which is remdesivir, which is an intravenous drug. While we're on antivirals, what we really need most, I would say, for antivirals is an oral drug. And an example of that is molnupiravir. That's a drug that's being developed. It's a pill, but it's not here yet. What about immune modulators? That's once you get into that severe or critical part of the disease. That's where we have the drug for which we have the most data that it saves lives, and that's a drug called dexamethasone, an old steroid that we've had for decades, and that does save lives if you have severe or critical disease. And then somewhat newer anti-inflammatories are those that target particular parts of the immune system. One is an anti-interleukin-6 antibody called tocilizumab. That's a very targeted approach to reducing excess inflammation. And then you'll hear about drugs like colchicine and other things. Those are also working as anti-inflammatories. And then last, I'll conclude with this, is the anticoagulants. Those are blood thinners being studied in outpatients, but right now there are some emerging data, we should see it soon, looking at these anticoagulants or blood thinners in people who have severe or critical disease. So 3 classes: antivirals, anti-inflammatories, anticoagulants, and you use them at different phases of disease: antivirals early, anti-inflammatories, and anticoagulants once people are ill. That's at least our current understanding.
Thank you very much for that. That really helps level that playing field. Mike, I'm going to turn to you next. How has treatment evolved since the beginning of the pandemic? Can you kind of walk us through that?
Absolutely. And thank you, Eleanor. It's really great to be with Research America. And also I'm really just excited to be with these expert panelists. So thanks for the opportunity to be here and share pharma's perspective. I also really like getting to follow Dr. Ghandi's great perspective. I've relied very heavily on my infectious disease colleagues throughout the pandemic. And I look at it from my own perspective, working in the emergency department. You know, a year ago when we started seeing patients come through our doors with COVID-19, the toolbox was basically empty. We really didn't have anything with any data behind it to offer patients. And I can remember looking at these x-rays of lungs of patients that were short of breath and coughing, and seeing this disease and being amazed and humbled by the fact that there was really nothing that I could offer those patients from a pharmaceutical standpoint. There weren't any proven interventions at that point. And as an ER physician, the key decision that I make is whether or not someone is safe to go home or they need to be admitted to the hospital for those supportive measures that we were just talking about. And really early on, there was a huge debate about all of this, whether or not we could even use Tylenol or Advil. We should be telling people to take those medicines if they had a fever. And it's just kind of striking how far we've come in just a year. So really, if someone's safe to go home, I would counsel people to go home and isolate. And I think the main distinction now is when I admit people, there are medicines that have data behind them that show that they can improve life or shorten hospitalization course. And then for people that are being discharged home, that are safe to be discharged home, we really need to evolve our messaging in the way that we talk about, it's not just go home and isolate, but if you're being diagnosed not in an emergency department, if you're at a testing site or in an urgent care, talk to your doctor or talk to others about monoclonal antibodies, because that might be an option if you were the right, if you meet certain criteria, because those could potentially keep you out of the hospital. So I appreciate all the background mentioned for hospitalized patients. I think it was absolutely right what was just covered, that we need more research and more development from pharmaceutical companies, vaccine companies on this monoclonal antibodies for different forms of injection, infusion, subcutaneous, and then also research underway for those antivirals so that ER docs like me could potentially prescribe them for outpatients. I think that's certainly a goal that we might want to have, an oral or an inhaled medicine that could be used on an outpatient basis. So we've come a long way, but there's more work and more progress that I think we're going to see in the coming months.
Great, thank you, Mike. So I'm going to jump to my third question, which is the obstacles that are hindering broader access to the treatments, and maybe how those obstacles are being addressed, or how we would like to see them addressed in the future. And so Jim, I'm going to turn to you on that question. Jim, I think your sound is not on yet. Maybe you're still on mute.
Thank you. Now, I promise that's the first time I've done this in the Zoom era.
It's the first time we've seen it.
That's right. Well, I would say, drawing an analogy to the economic recession of 2008, 2009, which was a stress test for our national economy, this pandemic was a stress test for our health system. And so areas that were weak and gaps really were highlighted during this time, and they were obstacles for therapy. So one of those is fragmentation of health system. As you heard from Raj, someone with, say, moderate disease as an outpatient, but with risk factors might have the decision to be infused by monoclonals, but how does the physician connect with the infusion sites? There were poor handoffs in these kinds of areas. We're built as a health system for little excess capacity and not rapid expansion of capacity. And so we had to do things. Institutions would expand their ICU capabilities in sort of a creative, almost not pre-planned way. We had complex supply chains. So one of the ventilator manufacturers is here in the States, and yet the pieces that go into that ventilator come from 14 different countries. And then also what was pointed out as an obstacle is the lack of health equity. And we knew that there was a lack of equity in the healthcare system before, but boy, this put a shining light on it when we started seeing minority populations being hospitalized and dying at 2, 3, 4 times the rate of the white populations. We also linked to not having excess capacity. We didn't have the critical care workforce that we needed. And so folks that were trained in other areas had to be recruited. And we didn't have good data systems that linked our healthcare system to the public health system. So all of these things are targets, and one can see sort of remedies of each one. So for example, another obstacle in healthcare broadly is the administrative burden that physicians face. I mean, our own multi-market studies show that for every hour a physician is face-to-face with a patient, there are 2 hours of administrative load. Those requirements allowed some flexibility during the public health emergency so that folks could actually do what they're trained to do and spend more of their time practicing as physicians. So I think, thinking of the problem of the healthcare system being so fragmented, unlinked to public health, little excess capacity, and our supply chains are probably too complicated. And we have to do something about health equity. A simple way of thinking about the equity problem to me is we've spent decades on quality and safety, trying to get uniform quality, uniform safety, progressively better and better. But it's clear you can't have quality uniform and you can't have safety in a uniform way if you don't have equity. And so really there's a triangulation between these three things that need to be addressed.
Great, thank you. I think my next question, which is going to be for Denise, really is an offshoot of the kinds of things that you've been talking about, Jim. So Denise, of course, certain populations we all know have been more adversely affected by COVID than others. And some of the obstacles that Jim just talked about even magnify some of those adverse effects. Could you comment on that, on what's happening with the populations that are more adversely affected, the way that what are the obstacles that are in their way, and kind of some of the activities that you've been engaged in to help overcome some of those obstacles?
Absolutely, Eleanor. And I will agree that Jim set the stage for what we experienced in Michigan. So I think definitely when we talk about treatment and barriers, everything that he said, I would echo. What I think I'm proud to say, though, is that one of the things that Michigan was able to do is coalesce really quickly once we saw some of the data. And I think we were surprised, right, to see that the outcomes were so disparate as it related to mortality. And there was also everything else that's been described, right? Confusion about what treatments were, and if there really was treatment, right? We, in the very, very beginning, because we didn't have success a lot of times with people actually surviving, were unclear of what those options were. So we quickly saw, though, I think it was 40% of those that were affected with COVID that were African American were dying from the disease. So when that data point came out, and just to put in context, in the state of Michigan, African Americans probably only represent 15% in the population. So it was the disparity in that number and the overrepresentation, quite honestly, in deaths that caused, I think, our governor appropriately to step back and speak with our healthcare leaders from an institution perspective. And we at Henry Ford Health System, as an example, began to drill into our data. Our colleagues were drilling into their data as well. So you would have to think the first thing we wondered is, are we doing something different? Is the treatment different? Why are we getting this different outcome? Unfortunately, the thing we found quickly is access was different. How people could enter into the organizations to find care and treatment was it highly, highly variable. Knowledge around how to prevent COVID, totally different in different communities. So our governor put in place a racial disparities task force related to COVID. So very front and center, targeting that issue. And so first we acknowledged that really it was a problem, and we put a lot of activity in place. And you probably will ask subsequent questions about that. But just from an opening perspective, things that we tried to attack, and it really wasn't maybe so much treatment itself, but it was allowing people to know that there were treatments. So if you saw disease progression, teaching people the signs and symptoms, we at Henry Ford, as an example, actually gave people COVID kits, we called them, but it was a pulse oximeter, it was a thermometer, it was a mask. It was trying to empower communities to be able to at least watch at home, to know when they needed to go to the emergency room. We unfortunately had what I think a lot around the country had, people being turned away from emergency rooms because they weren't perceived to be sick enough. So we thought one intervention was just help people to know how sick they needed to be before they went to the ED. Lots of public education and awareness. So we did a lot of outreach on social media. We used our, actual media and our news to begin to educate and encourage people to come. If you had these symptoms, stay home. If you have those symptoms, and really take away some of the fear around seeking treatment, because one of the other things we saw is that African Americans were perhaps presenting sicker. And so that was something else that we tried to control for or encourage and take away that fear of people coming into the emergency departments. The only other thing I would add is one of the first things our task force was challenged with was increasing testing, because we were aware of a lot of events that had occurred in the community that we know were contributing to the spread. And because early, right, we didn't necessarily have the same knowledge and thoughts around, how to treat necessarily and cure. We knew that prevention and stopping the spread was something we could also do, to support communities, and in particular, the African-American community deaths that we saw early. Literally, the contact tracing could show that it was because people were in events and they weren't social distancing perhaps, and they weren't, wearing masks. And at that time, we didn't know about the benefits of the PPE and the social distancing, but we knew that testing was powerful. So if you knew you had it, then you would know to quarantine. So lots of amazing activity that came out of there that I'm happy to share as we continue the conversation. I think you're on mute, Eleanor.
I didn't want Jim to feel bad. Before I continue with the list of questions that I have prepared, I'm going to turn to Terry, who's going to go to our Q&A so that we can jump in on a couple of the questions that have come through. Terry?
Sure, thanks, Eleanor. We've got one question from Florida where there have been reports that monoclonal antibody treatments, which have been shown to reduce the risk of hospitalization, maybe by 70%, are less available and less known in minority communities, something Denise kind of just touched on. How do we make them more widely available? And is there a different treatment avenue that we should be pursuing altogether?
Denise, I'm going to jump to you on that one to start, and then we can talk about the other treatment avenues.
Yeah, I mean, what I can say we have attempted and we continue to do, so our task force, uniquely in our state, task force can typically come together to do a report. This group has been an actionable task force that is still in place. We came together like early March of last year. And so the idea around education to what treatment options are there is still a part of our platform. And as I said, we've been using social media, also using physicians, right? We had another initiative around connecting people from a telehealth perspective, and we could probably have a whole different conversation about the barriers that were there for people in terms of technology and access, and being able to connect with providers once the ambulatory environment froze, because that's what it did here. It kind of froze. And connecting people to their providers is what we're doing now, so that they have a place to go and get good information about, what treatment options really do exist. I love the cliff notes that Dr. Ghandi shared earlier, and think that that's something we need to be placing with the public, because that was education for me, to be perfectly honest. And I work in a research organization where we talk about treatment all the time, but I think we do need the simple communication tools to get to the community so that they feel confident that if in fact, they or their loved ones have COVID, there are treatments, right? There are treatments that exist in the ambulatory outpatient setting as well as in the inpatient setting. And what are they? And how do you gain access to them? And so I think we've continued to do a lot of education on platforms that we know people use. And I think that might be the answer in Florida as well, right? How do you utilize community groups, community organizations, and spread the word, right? That there really is treatment, and people should be connecting if they don't have a regular relationship with the physician. Our health departments, from a public health perspective, I think it's been noted as well. We have lifted health departments, I think, in a lot of our communities. Federally qualified health centers have become integral parts of this fight as well. So every access point that's available should be armed with, right, what do people do, when faced with COVID? And that it's not all hospitalization, right? There are lots of things that are helpful in the outpatient setting.
I might
Raj,
also add
go ahead, Raj.
to what's been said. I think with the monoclonal antibodies in particular, there are two reasons why the uptake hasn't been as vigorous as one might have thought. One was the data itself, because when the data first came out at the end of last year that supported the emergency use authorizations, and we can talk about what's the difference between a emergency use authorization and full approval, but The data initially was based on kind of phase 2 trials, which means trials that are not extraordinarily large. They're in the hundreds rather than the thousands of people. And as a result, the treatment guidelines panel, of which I'm a member, thought that the monoclonal antibodies looked promising, but there was the number of events in terms of the placebo group versus the antibody group was relatively small, and so it was hard to be particularly confident. But over time, and as recently as just the last month, now the trials have expanded to be more than 1,000 people, and the participant is absolutely right. They do reduce hospitalizations by 70%, and now the guidelines committee actually has a lot more confidence in that because the trials are larger. Once you have larger trials, the results are more robust and more definitive. And just this week, a couple of days ago, 2 days ago or a day ago, the National Institutes of Health Treatment Guidelines panel endorsed the use of one of the two. There's several products out there, but one of the products, bamlanivimab, etesevimab is the complicated name, but it's a combination of monoclonal antibodies, and that's based on these larger trials. I would say, though, the major reason why they weren't taken up is what the participant is alluding to, and what we just heard is just the sheer logistics of doing some of these, and that speaks to this point of needing easier therapies. When these antibodies first came out, there were 1-hour infusions with another hour of observation, and if you put it all together, it's a couple of hours, 2-3 hours at least. And it was also for a group of people who had spent the last 11 months saying, stay home, isolate, don't come to the clinics, because we didn't have anything to offer. And so we had to now change our messaging. We had to give that a more broadly visible message throughout the communities, including the most afflicted communities. And then we had to physically set up sites in which to give these antibodies. Now the antibody infusions have become shorter. Now they're in the 20-minute range, which is good. You still have that 1-hour observation. But this is at a time, and we're not going to talk about vaccines, but at a time that the entire country appropriately is trying to really ramp up vaccines. So there was a lot of logistical things that came together. And I'm hopeful as the case numbers go down, as the evidence gets more definitive, as we get the message out there, that it'll be less underutilized or more utilized. How about that? So.
Terry, you want to jump to the next question?
Sure. This is another question for Denise. This member says they're so happy to hear that the kit that was distributed included pulse oximeters, but wants to touch on the awareness about proven racial bias in pulse oximetry measurement, meaning that a person with darker skin might be more worse off to receive supplemental oxygen. Can you touch on that?
I think I probably have to defer to I understand the question. I don't know that I have the definitive answer. So I don't know if Mike maybe, or
Mike or Jim, you want to jump? Do you want to jump in on that?
I'll just mention that the pulse oximeters have been noted to have a bias and to be less accurate with dark skin. And so there was a racial difference in the quality of data provided by a lot of the pulse oximeters.
And is that still an ongoing problem, or has that been addressed in any way?
Being addressed, but I would imagine it's still an ongoing problem. It points to the kind of biases that occur even in product development in medicine, and that was a really important example of one.
Certainly. Terry, next question.
Sure. One question that's come up, switching gears a little, is there any new clarity on convalescent plasma?
Can start, and then let others, or unless Mike, you would like to, you're welcome, whatever you prefer.
Oh, please, you can go first. I'm happy to jump in after you.
So, convalescent plasma is another interesting story. I mean, this whole pandemic has been quite dynamic. So we remember back in August when the emergency use authorization for convalescent plasma was issued. It was based on, it had been widely used throughout the United States. More than 100,000 people in the US have gotten convalescent plasma. But the early data was from essentially an expanded access program without a comparison group. And one thing we've learned in all of medicine, but it's really been highlighted in COVID, is without a comparison group, it's very hard to be sure that something is really working. And so what we've learned over the months since August is that there's probably a phase where convalescent plasma is unlikely to work. That is, once someone is on a mechanical, on a ventilator, or is too far along past that viral phase that I was alluding to at the beginning. At that point, these plasma, which is largely, again, working as an antiviral, we think, it's plasma has antibodies in it, antibodies bind virus. So we believe that convalescent plasma is binding up virus and clearing it. So once someone is very sick, or if they've been sick for a long time, I think the data are not supporting convalescent plasma. There are data from Argentina that support the use of convalescent plasma if you're very, very early. When I say very early, we're talking about 2 or 3 days into symptoms, and you have a lot of risk for worsening. I think they did it in people over the age of 65, and a lot of them were over the age of 75, so a high-risk population. But quickly, they got the convalescent plasma, and there was a benefit. The EUA, ironically, right this minute, supports the use of convalescent plasma in hospitalized patients, not in those outpatients where the Argentinian study was done. So I think we're still trying to find the right place for convalescent plasma. It hasn't yet been considered standard therapy. It is authorized for use. The FDA recently updated their authorization to say if you're going to use it, use high titers of plasma, and the earlier the better. But I think it's still a challenge after all these months. But I think plasma and antibodies have a similar kind of, I think they're going to end up with a similar place in our armamentarium. So.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it reinforces what you said at the beginning that I also agree with, that I think about COVID as kind of having these 2 distinct phases, where you have the first phase where it's likely the virus itself that is causing you to feel sick and causing the damage. And then at a certain point, usually later in the illness, it's actually not the virus that's causing people to be sick in the ICU. It's actually the immune system that has been overactivated, which is why we kind of separate the treatments into almost 2 buckets, where you would want to use monoclonal antibodies, and as the data that was referenced, the use of convalescent plasma, which is probably the same type of approach, just the monoclonal antibodies are really they're the highest titer. They're the ones that are binding and neutralizing COVID most effectively. So I think it's, we're starting to really gel in this concept that it's the virus in the first half, and then it's the immune system in the second half. And I think your treatment pathways are going to really spill out from there.
So Mike, you said something that leads me to the next question, because you said treatment pathways. And so I want to ask you and Jim to comment on what do you think are the biggest challenges for the physicians and the clinicians right now in making these treatment, well, they're making assessments of these patients, and then they're making treatment decisions based on those assessments. What's going on that front line?
Certainly. Well, it has absolutely been a challenge to learn an entirely new field of medicine in 1 year, to become COVIDologists, COVID practitioners. In the emergency department, one thing that we're very used to is diversity. We see a patient with chest pain, and then we see abdominal pain, and then we see an ankle fracture. And for the first few months of the pandemic, it was 60, 70, 80% COVID. And that is very, very unusual. So we had to learn how to take care of this illness very quickly, and the science is changing very rapidly. I'll just piggyback on what was said a minute ago about the use of monoclonal antibodies. And I think that they're being underutilized now. That's what the kind of national distribution data shows. There's more monoclonal antibody available that's being used. That doesn't mean there might not be a local shortage at a particular hospital. But I think we also started with monoclonal antibodies, and we were very specific. We had very institutionally specific pathways, could only give it to people that had really high risk factors. And now that we're learning more about them, as has been mentioned, and the data, more data is starting to come out, and there's also fewer supply issues, we're starting to see some loosening of restrictions, and I think that is all really, really helpful. As physicians, we really kind of just need to know how to answer the 3 most common questions that we're going to get asked, and they're actually very similar with vaccines and with therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies. Are they safe? Are they effective? What are the side effects? I mean, those are the 3 things that 99% of patients are going to ask. And so it's been a real education to ourselves get up to speed on them and feel confident in answering those questions. So that's my take on it. Jim, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, Jim, what challenges are the physicians seeing out there?
Well, folks like Mike and Raj were right in the middle of it. And I don't see patients, but a variety of biopsies across the healthcare system really showed a frightening context in which this was all occurring. In April, I remember speaking to the head of the emergency department of a large hospital in Brooklyn. That hospital in the emergency department had 15 bays, and currently there were 85 gurneys occupied by patients, largely with COVID in there. So there was an overwhelming challenge where this had to be done. And as Mike said, people were, in South Carolina, a family medicine general practitioner was doing critical care in the ICU and this was happening in all the kind of the hot spots. The other aspect I would put a finger on from our experience with JAMA, our journal, is the rapidity of data emergence and its incompleteness a lot of times. So as Raj suggested, you need a comparative group, randomized clinical trial, but that takes time. There's a pandemic happening. Are you going to allow a certain amount of observational studies? And it was the observational studies that led to the recognition that flipping patients into a prone position would take the weight of the heart off the lungs and improve management. And then even the randomized clinical trials will often come first out of preprint servers that have not been peer reviewed. And the peer review is yet another process. One of the things that I have to say that was remarkable about American physicians is that this JAMA alone had a 2.5 time increase in submissions during that first half of 2020. And much of that increase was COVID related. Physicians were incredibly busy with their work, and yet physician scientists stepped up to the plate and did really rapid reviews for us. And I assume the same was seen at New England Journal and Lancet. So thinking about this balance between rigor and accuracy, the strength of the structure of the trial, are there observational things that are low risk that could be applied? And, the history of this produced, the panic around hydroxychloroquine, and then, vitamin D, ivermectin, an antiparasitic, will be shown in a paper next week, not to be as hot as one might think. And it feels like things like colchicine are on deck. And how to balance all this rigor, completeness, randomized clinical trial, peer review, in the face of a pandemic where 500,000 people have died in our country is also a challenge, I think.
Yeah, maybe I'll just piggyback on that, because as a member of these treatment guidelines panels, we rely on the information that the journals are vetting and reviewing, and it has been a challenge of titanic proportions. I mean, I think that 2.5 times that he was alluding to is on top of a very steady stream pre-COVID, and then if you double or triple that, it's really an infodemic or an epidemic of information. It's incredible. I will say, if we go back to our first principles from other fields of medicine, I'm an HIV physician, and so I think a lot about that. In the days of HIV, which is very different, it had a different pace to it. It didn't have the same, concentrated acuity, but nevertheless, there was a lot of improvement therapies. There was a lot of pressure to use improvement therapies in the early 90s. And it was because patients, clinicians, and the journals really came together to get us the information we need to have combination antivirals for HIV, that HIV now is very much a treatable disease. And it was over years, and COVID is happening over weeks or days or months, I mean, much quicker. But it's the same principles as you make an advance, you iterate on it, you go from AZT to several drugs, and then you combine them, and then you get what you need. And so in COVID, it's happening more quickly because of it's a faster disease. It doesn't play out over years, it plays out over days. But it's the same kind of principle as you have an advance, you iterate, meaning you build upon it, and then you get better. And the journals, for sure, the treatment guidelines committees are always looking to the journals to figure out, where are things so we can make some recommendations to our peers. So
If I could, I would add to that by saying that it's important to have a kind of a nuanced thinking about how we communicate to the public. There's a big difference between saying this is the treatment that works and should be used for you, versus based on current knowledge, which is incomplete, we think this is the treatment that should be used for you. When we leave out those modifiers in an actively and dynamic changing situation, and we change based on evidence, without having those modifiers, the public thinks we don't know what we're doing, and it's confusing.
For sure.
Denise, do you have a comment on that? That seems like that would tie in with the media work and the communications work that you've been doing.
Yeah, I was going to say, Eleanor, and I'm sitting here shaking my head. So now I'm the third one with being on mute, right? But absolutely, I agree that when Jim spoke, it made me really think of one of the things that we saw in Michigan was the distrust that was perhaps already there for some groups was exacerbated with this lack of precision, right? So not changing things literally, and we were changing things on a daily basis around visitation. If you just think about what the public relies on, their physician, their health systems, and their data and information to do is to help them to figure out, right, what to trust, what's real, what things are going to give them an advantage, or make the situation better. And this rapid change that we had, and this need, quite honestly, to say we didn't know sometimes, or literally what maybe we said 2 days ago, had to dramatically shift, was tough, I think, in the beginning, but I think we've gotten better. And we can continue to improve, because the thing we're not talking about today, when we talk about our path forward, I would say, part of that is figuring out treatment. And I know we don't consider, vaccines per se a treatment of COVID, but when you look at that category of where we are in communication, it's all of the above, and trying to give people information, because that's another place of, do we know what we don't know? Because we're being deeply challenged by the community and those that maybe are not, early adopters, to be definitive about what will and will not happen in their categories of uncertainty. So that has been a huge shift, and all we've been able to conclude is you have to share what you have and share it in an honest way, and allow people to be engaged, in dialogue around what their fears are.
If I could add one more thing to the communication piece, I think we in medicine often think that it would be great if Americans broadly understood the scientific method better, and what science was all about, how trials are done and whatnot. But in working with communication professionals at a couple of universities, they point out to me that actually, in large part, Americans don't care to have an educational component on science. They want to know from pulpits that they trust and centers that they trust, what's the bottom line? And one of the things that's related to that kind of communication is that if the scientific advice comes from a mouth that is political, and it can even be accurate advice, you have immediately politicized the scientific communication. And it should come from people like Tony Fauci and Raj and folks like that, that don't politicize the thing up front. And that was also, I think, a major mistake in communications in the pandemic.
So stemming off of that statement, Jim, I think there are probably some lessons learned here that we've had from this past year. And so I want to ask all of you to think about, what are those lessons learned? Someone in the Q&A asked about lessons learned from treatments that are being used around the world. And what did we learn from that? And what could we take away from it for the future? Also, in terms of emergency use authorization, many of these treatments got emergency use authorization. And what are the lessons learned for the future coming from those kinds of things? So I'd like for all of you to kind of give your view on aspects of lessons learned in terms of the way information was communicated, what we learned through international partnerships and learnings, and then just scientifically, what can we glean from this past year that might help us in the future with this kind of a crisis or similar kinds of healthcare crises? So anyone want to jump in on any of that?
Well, I would point out one thing we learned is that when flexibility and relaxed administrative requirements were faced, things, for example, telemedicine. Telemedicine advanced in 10 months the way I would have imagined it would have taken 10 years.
Yeah. Or 20.
If we keep those flexibilities, meaning that you don't have geographic restrictions and various other restrictions, that would be great. We have a $4 trillion a year nearly healthcare expend in this country. It's estimated that $1 trillion of that is waste, and the biggest chunk of that waste is administrative burden. And if we can have our healthcare system taking care of patients rather than checking boxes, I think that would be a very positive thing.
In that regard, on the research front, I can still have this very distinct memory in March of 2020 when, at the time we really didn't know how to treat our patients, as Mike and others were saying, at all. We had really no information. In fact, the first iteration of these guidelines were, we didn't know anything worked. The first iteration of all of them were, we have insufficient data that either recommend for or against any treatment. That was March. But the flexibility that was shown back then in terms of remote site visits for research, expedited IRB, institutional review board, human subject protection reviews, they were reviewing on the weekends, they were reviewing at nighttime. That allowed a bunch of places around the country to quickly set up trials so that by the time we got to June, we actually had some information. We knew about remdesivir. The UK did an amazing job in their National Health Service and gave us the data that supports dexamethasone in hospitalized patients. And I do worry a little bit that a year in, that some of that intensity and urgency, which I understand can't be sustained forever, that we might be falling a bit back into our older patterns, which we can't really go back to. I think we need to have flexibility and urgency around this pandemic and other things as well. Maybe the last thing I'll say is, it's been written that in a pandemic, not only should you do research during a pandemic, but you absolutely must do research during a pandemic, because during a pandemic, it's a new virus or a new entity and you have no idea what works. So if you don't do research, you never learn what works. And so that's, I think, one of the other lessons that I learned forcefully. I learned it in HIV, but I relearned it forcefully with COVID, is you've got to do that research, because otherwise we would be using drugs that turned out not to work and we wouldn't even know.
Yeah, that's a great point. I completely agree with that. I think just a few points from the pharmaceutical perspective and the vaccine developer perspective. I think industry is really, it's a global industry. We have diverse global supply chains. We study medicines on a global basis, and that really is to our benefit. I think it's going to help us stay on top of things like variants that we're studying these medicines and vaccines around the world. Again, globally diverse industry because it's a global pandemic. So I think that's to our benefit, not to our detriment. The second industry point is just the collaboration that we've seen among member companies within pharma. They're sharing manufacturing capacity. We've seen that on the vaccine front, where companies are volunteering their manufacturing capacity to increase the supply of vaccine, and the same can be said for therapeutics as well. The monoclonal antibodies that we keep mentioning, these are not easy medicines to manufacture, and you can't just build a plant overnight. So companies collaborating and working together, as well as sharing data. The fact that they're not viewing each other, as enemies, we're all on the same team to try and beat the pandemic. And the last point, after kind of those first two, is just the changes to clinical trials. I think this ties in nicely to what the other panelists were saying, but adopting things like digital clinical trials, telemedicine's adoption in clinical trials, very, very helpful. I was in one of the COVID vaccine trials and experienced it firsthand how beneficial it is to not need to drive an hour to a clinical trial site and be able to do a telemedicine visit, enter information in an app. Those are all barriers that I think got broken down very quickly that we need to not allow to come back in the post-pandemic world.
Denise, anything to add?
Yes, I echo everything that was said. So the piece I would add, of course, is we definitely saw, and we started this way, right, that racial disparities really do exist. And I think there's been a call to action right here to say that we could be working more collaboratively and aggressively to eliminate disparities, because we would have had a healthier population that faced COVID, in particular when it relates to some of the underserved and underrepresented groups. And so kind of the call to action, I think, that we're seeing, and I hope this is echoed around the country, we have from a state now mandated that all of our licensed professionals going forward will have anti-bias training. We're seeing many of our health systems. I'm fortunate to work with one that really sat already in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, but others that didn't are now coming to the table in partnership to say that we won't do this way again, if ever, it were to happen. Infrastructure, you guys have talked about this, telemedicine. We have a state task force on that to make sure that our Medicaid recipients would be able to be in a healthy place if we ever were faced with a pandemic similar to this virus again, where we had to retreat from our primary care offices and be in our homes, to be safe. How can we make sure that that infrastructure is there? So I think lots of lessons learned, and at least I'm proud of the state of Michigan. And I know that Research America has acknowledged and recognized the work that was done, by the state as well. And so hopefully those lessons will be shared and spread.
Great, and I love that you refer to the work as a call to action. The National Health Council did some work in health equity, and our end of year report in 2021 was actually named call to action. So many of us are thinking along the same lines. I want to go to something that someone mentioned in the chat that was on the back of my mind. What are we thinking about, and what's happening in terms of treatments for the long haulers? Any thoughts on that, or anything that that's happening in terms of those folks who've had COVID and now have long-term ramifications from the illness? What are we thinking about for them?
Well, I'll just say, Raj and Mike may have better thoughts, but I'll just say it seems to me completely unknown. And the treatments are really, symptomatic oriented or organ oriented. People are finding about a third of the cases will have lung scarring that doesn't go away. CAT scans have shown heart inflammation in about a third of the patients. No one knows if that resolves, but about a third of the patients have a long-term sequela, fatigue, what's referred to loosely as brain fog. In the SARS epidemic, there were similar long-term consequences. And the worry that we would have is, 85% of that $4 trillion spend goes toward chronic disease. And we've gone from, in the last half century, of a society with largely episodic and now largely chronic disease problems. And this gives us another stream of chronic disease. So the COVID has really been sort of the Rosemary's baby for healthcare in all of these various ways.
Just yesterday, Dr. Fauci announced well, first of all, they changed the name, or they keep changing the name because he's now calling it
long COVID. Yeah,
he's calling it post-acute sequelae of COVID-19, or PASC. So we'll see where that goes. But I think NIH appropriately is going to devote some serious resources to seeing if we can go beyond symptomatic management, because first we need to define the problem. We have some numbers on how often it occurs, but then what's its longevity and how can we intervene? And clinics have been set up all over the country for this, but now some serious research is going to need to be done and is being done to get an answer, because this is a big problem. I would agree. I do want to say, though, the equity issues that were highlighted before, as well as one other benchmark I think that the FDA could help us with, as they did with vaccines very successfully, is giving some benchmarks around therapeutics, whether it be for long COVID or whether it be for acute COVID, having some benchmarks so that and some pre-planning around how those benchmarks would be reviewed and communicated. And then, of course, the distribution that comes out of an EUA. All of these are critical in terms of the way forward. So.
Great. I did want to ask one other question, and it was also something that popped up in the Q&A and chat, and that was just thinking through the treatments that we have available now and the evolution of those treatments. Anything that we know now or anticipate in terms of what happens with the new variants and those treatments?
Yeah, I sort of touched on this just a minute ago. It's something that's absolutely on the radar of pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacturers to make sure that any potential treatment or vaccine that a new variant would still, these therapies and vaccines would still be effective against new variants. So we've seen really kind of big announcements in the last few days on the vaccine front. And then as it relates to monoclonal antibodies, the developers are also looking to ensure that the monoclonal antibodies are effective against those new variants. So it's absolutely on the radar. It's something that manufacturers are able to kind of quickly research and assess. And we're seeing data come out all the time about which therapies have been tested against which variants. And again, it just goes back to the point. It's good that we have kind of a global industry that's able to look at this from all parts of the world, so that we can try and stay ahead of all of these variants. It's absolutely a concern, but it's also absolutely on the radar of the vaccine and the pharma manufacturers.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all. I'm going to turn this back over to Ellie because we are almost out of time.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I really want to thank all of you, Eleanor, Denise, Raj, Jim, Mike. This was terrific. Also, I want to thank our partners again, the Infectious Diseases Society of America, and I'm going to spell it out this time, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, or PhRMA. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us and for adding so much to this through your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. If you're not familiar with Research America, we're an alliance of organizations. We reflect the diversity of the R&D ecosystem. Our mission is to advocate for faster medical, public health, and scientific progress, and I know they're all of a piece, that benefits everyone, everywhere. And we've put our website, I hope we have, into the chat, but find us, check us out, and if your organization isn't a member, join us. We're stronger for every single member with this goal. So with that, I'll wrap up, and thanks to you all again. This was just wonderful.